The ice in the glasses clinked in time with Marcus's laughter. I stood in the hallway, the weight of the silver tray digging into my palms, listening to the man I'd shared a bed with for 4 years tell his friends I was nothing more than a glorified nanny. He didn't just deny our bond, he erased it. In that moment, the house didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a cage I'd finally found the key to. I didn't move, not right away. My fingers found the edge of the tray and I pressed down until the pressure in my palms was the only thing keeping me grounded. Through the gap in the double doors, I could see the back of Marcus's head, the way he leaned back in his chair with that particular ease he only had when he felt completely untouchable. 3 of his associates sat across from him, men I'd made dinner for, men I'd smiled at when they came through our front door. One of them, I think his name was Dren, the one with the square jaw and the signet ring, gestured toward the hallway with his glass. "Is that your Omega? Didn't know you kept one." Marcus didn't even pause. He picked up his drink, swirled it once, and said, "That's Kyle's caretaker. He's been with us since Kyle was born. Good with the kid." Kyle, our son, our pup, our son. The tray was still in my hands. I set it down on the side table so carefully that the glasses didn't make a sound. Then I straightened up, turned, and walked back toward the kitchen. Not fast, not slow, just walked. The way you walk when you understand that running would be the last thing to save your dignity. I didn't cry. I want you to understand that. Not in the hallway, not in the kitchen, not when I poured the soup I'd spent 2 hours making down the drain because I couldn't stand to watch those men eat food I made with my hands. I didn't cry. What I did was go upstairs. Kale was asleep in his room, wedged between his pillow and the stuffed rabbit he'd named Pip 3 months ago and refused to sleep without. He was 3 years old. He smelled like the lavender soap I'd bought specifically for his sensitive skin, and his mouth was open just slightly the way it always was when he fell into deep sleep. I stood in the doorway for a moment with my hand on the frame. Then I went to my own room, the room that was supposed to be ours, and I opened the wardrobe. I didn't have a plan, exactly. I had the clarity that comes when something finally stops pretending to be something it isn't. I pulled out a canvas bag from the back shelf, the kind with the worn straps that I used for errands. I put in 2 changes of clothes for Kale, a Ziploc bag of his allergy medication, the card from the last health check, the one the pediatrician had signed, his rabbit, 2 pairs of his socks, the ones with the little bears on the ankles. For myself, 2 shirts, 1 pair of trousers, a sweater that had a small hole at the right elbow, my documents, the folder I kept in the bottom drawer of the nightstand, my phone charger, the roll of emergency cash I'd been building in a sock for 2 years, adding to it 20 here, 50 there out of the household budget I managed. Not stolen, planned for. There's a difference. I changed into the warmest thing I owned. Thick-soled boots, the trousers with the deep pockets, the gray coat Marcus had told me was too bulky. I stood at the mirror and looked at myself for 3 seconds. Then I put the bag over my shoulder and went back to Kale's room. He made a sound when I lifted him, that half-conscious grunt that pups make when you disturb them, and then settled against my chest with the full, trusting weight of a child who has never once doubted whether the person holding him will keep him safe. His rabbit dangled from one chubby fist. I tucked a blanket around him, pulled the canvas bag strap higher on my shoulder, and walked down the stairs. The voices were still coming from the dining room. Marcus laughed again. The clink of ice. I went through the kitchen, out the back door because the front was visible from the dining room window. The latch clicked behind me, and the night air hit my face. Mid-November, and it had the kind of temperature that gets into the gaps of your collar and sits there. The frost had already started on the windshields of the cars parked along the street. My breath came out in a pale plume. I walked. I had one friend whose number I knew by heart. Benny, who I'd been to school with, who had a couch in his apartment 12 blocks east and who had never once liked Marcus, a fact he'd been diplomatic enough to keep mostly to himself. I didn't have a phone signal until I was 4 blocks away from the house. I stopped under a street lamp to dial, Kale heavy and warm against my shoulder. Benny picked up on the 3rd ring, groggy from sleep. "I need your couch," I said. "Just for a few days." There was a 2-second silence, then, "I'll put the kettle on." I walked those 12 blocks with the canvas bag cutting into my shoulder and Kale's weight shifting every few steps as I adjusted my grip. My left arm started to ache somewhere around the 7th block. I switched him to the right, readjusted the bag, and kept walking. The street lamps threw yellow circles on the pavement. 2 cars passed. A cat watched me from a wall. By the time I knocked on Benny's door, the backs of my knees were wet with sweat, despite the cold, and Kale had woken up enough to ask me where we were going in his small, sleep-thickened voice. "Somewhere better," I told him. He seemed to find that satisfactory because he put his head back down on my shoulder and closed his eyes. Benny opened the door in an oversized t-shirt and the look of a man who understood without me having to say anything that we were not doing a post-mortem right now. He just stepped back and let us in, took the bag from my shoulder without asking, and pointed me toward the couch where he'd already put out a folded blanket and a pillow. I laid Kale down. He curled toward the pillow immediately, still gripping Pip. I pulled the blanket over him and sat on the floor beside the couch because the armchair suddenly seemed very far away. Benny put a mug of tea on the floor next to me without saying anything and went back to his room. I drank the tea. I looked at my son's sleeping face. Outside, somewhere down the street, a car alarm went off for 30 seconds and then stopped. I had 46,000 naira in that sock, which is less than it sounds for 2 people starting over. I had no job. I had a 3-year-old with a tree nut allergy and a rabbit named Pip. I had a coat that was too bulky and a hole in my sweater's elbow. And for the first time in 4 years, every single thing around me was mine. Benny's couch was a 2-seater, which meant that Kale slept on it and I slept on a fold-out mat that made a sound every time I turned over. I was fine with this. In the morning, Benny made eggs and did not ask me any questions, which was the most generous thing anyone had done for me in recent memory. I found my first job on the 3rd day. It was a cleaning contract, commercial buildings, the early morning shift that started at 4:30 a.m. The agency took 20% off the top, which made the hourly rate something you didn't want to think about too hard. But the supervisor was a woman named Mrs. Ugbako, who had seen everything and cared about nothing except whether the floors were clean. I respected that about her. The first week, I brought Kale with me. I had no choice. I'd carry him in from the cold and settle him in the supply room with his blanket and a juice box, and he would sleep curled under the shelf of industrial cleaning products like it was the most natural thing in the world. Children are more adaptable than we give them credit for. The smell of that room, a combination of pine fresh concentrate and industrial bleach, would stay in my memory long after everything else faded. I can still conjure it exactly. Sharp at the top of the throat, then chemical, then something vaguely like orange that didn't exist in nature. I mopped floors. I scraped dried food from under cafe chairs. I cleaned 3 office bathrooms per building, per shift. And I learned quickly that if you moved from left to right without backtracking, you saved 45 minutes per floor. Small economy. Big difference over 8 hours. My hands started to dry out by the end of week 1. By week 2, the skin at my knuckles had cracked in 3 places. I bought a small jar of petroleum jelly from a pharmacy and kept it in my apron pocket. Every time I switched from wet work to dry work, I used it. The cracks still bled sometimes, but slower. The heel blisters started from the boots. The soles were fine for short walks, but 8 hours of hard floors, concrete, tile, concrete again, found the seam on the inner heel and worked at it the way water works at a wall. By Thursday of week 2, I was walking with a slight favor of my left foot. I cut a piece of foam from Kale's old puzzle mat and fitted it inside the boot as a pad. Not ideal, functional. I got a second job in the evenings through a woman Benny knew, waitstaff at a catered events company. Irregular hours, but they paid per event, and the tips were decent when the crowd was the spending type. I wore a white shirt and black trousers and carried plates of food I couldn't afford to eat. Once, someone left half a plate of jollof rice and plantain at a table when the event wound down, and the senior waiter, a man named Chidi who had 20 years on me and no illusions about anything, tilted his head toward it and said, quietly, "They don't count what goes back to the kitchen." I ate that rice standing up next to the service station in 3 minutes, and it was the best meal I'd had in 2 weeks. The problem with 2 jobs is that Kale needed more than Benny's couch and a supply room to sleep in. Benny never complained. He never complained. But I watched him navigate his own small apartment around a toddler's toys and a drying rack of small clothes, and I understood without any conversation being necessary that this was a temporary grace. On the 18th day, I found a room. One room in a shared house on Adeleke Street with a landlord named Mr. Fashola, who looked at Kale and then looked at me and said he didn't usually take small children because of the noise, but his sister had been a single parent and so he supposed it was all right. 400,000 naira per month, which was most of what I was making from both jobs. It left us very little. Very little means Kale ate. Protein, vegetables, the allergy medication on time, every dose. I ate what was left. There were days I skipped lunch entirely. I'm not recounting this for sympathy. It's just the architecture of how survival works. You calculate, you subtract, you make the numbers add up in the column that matters. Kale's column mattered. My column was adjustable. What cost me more than food was the fear. Not the visible shaking kind, I didn't have the energy for that. It was the background fear, the kind that sits behind everything you do. The thought that Marcus might start looking, that he might send someone. That one day I would turn around at the cleaning company and find one of his associates standing in the doorway with that look, the particular look of someone who has been sent to collect a thing that belongs to someone else. I started varying my routes, never the same way to the building twice in a row. I moved Kale's daycare registration to a facility 3 streets over from the obvious choice, paid the registration in cash, and asked the director not to confirm enrollment over the phone to anyone who wasn't me. She looked at me steadily for a moment and said, "We have a code word system. Choose a word." "Pip," I said. Every morning, I dropped Kale at the daycare, walked to the cleaning job, mopped 8 hours of floor, walked back, collected him, went home, made dinner, bathed him, settled him to sleep, then went back out for the evening job if there was one. I was running on 5 hours of sleep by the end of week 3. My back ached from the mop handle in a specific way. Not a sharp pain, more like something that had lodged itself between my shoulder blades and vibrated at a low frequency through everything I did. I adapted. You do. The body is astonishing in what it accommodates when it has no choice. There was one night, though. The 3rd week of the 2nd month. Kale had a fever, mild, just the seasonal kind, but enough that he was clingy and couldn't settle. And I spent 4 hours walking him in a loop around our small room with his cheek against my neck and his temperature pressed into my skin. He was fine by morning, but I sat on the edge of our narrow mattress at 3 a.m. and I looked at the frost pattern on the inside of our single window. The glass was cheap, single-paned, and the condensation had frozen into a thin crust at the corners, and I thought, this is what I chose. And then I thought, yes, it was still the right choice. Kale stirred beside me, his fever broke, and he reached out in his sleep for Pip with the accuracy of a child who can locate his most important possession without ever opening his eyes. I lay down next to him and closed my eyes too. The events company got a contract for a regular Thursday night function, a private members club downtown, the kind of address that takes up a full city block and has a doorman who treats the air itself like something that has to earn entry. I had done these high-end events before. I knew the pace. Slow, calibrated, the particular choreography of moving through a room full of expensive suits without disturbing the atmosphere. I had been there 40 minutes when I noticed him. He was hard to miss, not because of what he wore, which was a plain dark jacket with no visible branding, but because of the way the room adjusted around him. Not in the theatrical way of someone showing off, but in the gravitational way of something real. Conversations paused a half beat when he passed. People turned fractionally toward him and then corrected, as if they hadn't meant to. He was an elite. I knew it the way any Omega knows it. Not a thought, exactly, more like a reading of the air. He was the sort of alpha that the word was made for. I was carrying a tray of champagne flutes toward the far end of the room when Kale's voice happened in my earpiece. I'd started using a small Bluetooth speaker clipped to my collar on event nights. The daycare had a late-night emergency line for the extended hours parents, and the director had given me the direct number. I had it on low volume, tucked just under my collar. No one noticed. No one was looking at the waitstaff. But I stopped walking because the message coming through wasn't from the daycare. It was a notification from the shared house's building app. Mr. Fashola used it to flag maintenance issues, and it told me that the water to my floor had been shut off for emergency repairs and would not be restored until morning. Kale had childcare in 4 hours. He needed a bath. He'd been playing at the park earlier with another child who had finger-painted on him with what looked like actual paint. I was standing in the middle of a floor full of $400 glasses of champagne, thinking about a child covered in green paint and a broken waterman when someone said, near my left shoulder, "You look like you're solving a very complicated equation." I turned. He was closer than I'd realized. The elite, the one the room had been quietly reorganizing itself around. Up close, he was 30-something, with the kind of stillness in his face that reads as either patience or danger, and usually turns out to be both. "Apologies," I said. "Can I get you something?" I'd shifted back into event mode automatically, the posture, the neutral expression. He glanced at the tray and then back at me. "What's the equation?" I considered not answering. "No running water tonight. I have a 3-year-old who needs a bath." I don't know why I said it. Maybe because he'd asked a real question and I was too tired for anything except real answers. He didn't say, "Oh, how difficult," or "how charming," or any of the responses that the moment seemed to suggest. He looked at me for a beat, not the way that men in expensive suits usually look at a waiter, which is a variety of not looking, but actually looked. "Where's the child now?" "Extended care at his daycare." "You've got it handled." It wasn't a question. He said it the way someone reads something out of what they can see. "I'll find a solution," I said. He nodded once, as if that was the correct answer to something, and moved on. I watched him for the rest of the event, the way you watch something that doesn't quite fit the category you thought it was in. He spoke to 3 people all night. Not the circling, glad-handing kind of socializing, but direct conversations, short, clearly concluding. He left early. On his way out, he stopped at the service station for a glass of water. Chidi was standing there and said something I couldn't hear. The elite said something back, and Chidi laughed. Real laughter, not the professional kind. On the walk home, I found that Mrs. Agbako's cousin ran a laundry facility 2 streets from my building that had a working sink. I arranged for a Kale's bath there, standing in a laundry room with the smell of fabric softener at 11:30 p.m., pouring warm water over a small head while Kale complained that he was not, in fact, dirty and the paint on his elbow was actually decoration. "It's paint," I said. "It's mine," he said. I washed it off anyway. He would survive the loss. He found me. Not in a sinister way. There was nothing sinister about it. But 3 days after the event, I was walking back from the morning cleaning shift in the early bray of a Tuesday, Kale's hand in mine. Both of us tilted against a wind that came from nowhere and wanted something from us. I was thinking about whether the food budget would stretch to buying Kale new shoes. He'd grown out of the last pair faster than expected, and the current ones rubbed at his little toe in a way he had stopped mentioning because I think he understood instinctively that I would worry about it. A car slowed beside us. Not dramatically. It didn't stop, at first, just matched our pace. A dark car, clean, no plates that screamed at you. The window came down. "The water main," he said. "Did you sort it?" I looked at him. "Yes." "And the child?" He glanced at Kale, who looked at him with the frank assessment of a 3-year-old. "Kale," Kale supplied, pointing to himself. "Silas," the man said, in the same tone, as if they were completing a transaction. Kale nodded, apparently satisfied. Silas looked back at me. "I looked into the building on Adeleke Street. The landlord, Fashola, has a maintenance citation 3 months old. The plumbing is going to keep failing." He said it the way you say something you verified. "I have a property on the same street, 2-bedroom, currently vacant. The rate is the same." I stopped walking. "Why?" I asked. He met my eyes without any performance in it. "Because you're doing something very hard, and you're doing it very well, and you shouldn't have to fight your own plumbing in the middle of it." There was nothing calculated in the way he said it, no angle I could find. I have become good at looking for angles. 4 years with Marcus will do that, and I turned the offer over in my mind the way you check a coin for a seam, and I found nothing. "I don't accept charity," I said. "It's not charity, it's a rental with working plumbing." He paused. "Come and see it. If you decide it's not right, that's the end of it." The apartment was on the first floor of a building that had good windows and a radiator that actually worked, and no smell of mildew anywhere. 2 bedrooms meant Kale had his own space, which he immediately claimed by running to the smaller one and sitting down in the center of the empty floor, as though completing a territory ritual. A kitchen with a full-sized hob, a bathroom with pressure in the taps. I stood in the main room and looked at the light coming through the windows. "I'll make payments weekly, the first 2 weeks in advance." Silas was standing in the doorway. "All right. And I want a written contract. I'll have it drawn up today." I turned to face him. I don't know what I was looking for in his expression. Maybe impatience, maybe condescension. Something that would tell me this was a trap dressed up in quiet courtesy. Instead, I found him looking back at me with that same quality of attention he'd had at the event, the kind that doesn't flinch from what it finds. "Why me?" I asked again, because the answer he'd given before was too small a container for what he was actually offering. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Because Kale pointed to himself and told me his name, and you kept walking without breaking stride. That's a child who doesn't doubt whether the person with him is keeping him safe." He looked at me directly. "A person who can do that for a child while managing everything you're managing, I want that person to have working plumbing. It's not complicated." Kale had come back out of the small bedroom and was standing next to me, leaning against my leg. Silas crouched down to his level. "What do you think?" he asked Kale. Kale considered this with the gravity of his 3 years. "There's a window," he said. "There is. Pip can see outside." "Pip can definitely see outside." Kale looked up at me. "I think it's good," he said. I signed the contract that afternoon. The terms were exactly what he'd said. Fair rate, weekly, 12-month term with option to renew. No conditions, no other clauses. I moved us in over the weekend. Benny helped carry things, and when I handed Kale down from his cab like a parcel, Silas was there. He had left a set of keys in the letterbox as promised, and he took the heavier bag from my hands without asking and carried it up the stairs. He stayed for an hour. He brought food. Not the showy kind, just provisions. Rice, oil, tins, a bottle of juice for Kale, a small bag of apples. He put them in the kitchen and said, "The radiator has a knack. You have to give it a tap here." He indicated a spot on the pipe, "if it starts making noise at night." I watched him tell me this and thought, very clearly, this is what care looks like when it has no agenda. Then he did something I was not expecting. He sat down at my kitchen table, put both hands flat on it, and looked at me with an expression that wasn't uncertain exactly, but that was deliberate in a way I hadn't seen him before. "I know what you came from," he said. "Not the details, but I know the shape of it. And I want to tell you something that is not contingent on anything, not on you being grateful, not on any reciprocal arrangement, not on anything except the fact that it is true and you should hear it." He paused. "You and Kale are safe. I will not allow anyone from your previous life to reach you. And if at any point you decide you want to go in a different direction entirely, that remains true. This is not a leash. It is a door, and it is open." The radiator made a sound then. I tapped the pipe where he'd shown me, and it quieted. "I heard you," I said. He nodded. He stood up, said goodbye to Kale, who had fallen asleep on the new living room floor with Pip on his chest in a patch of afternoon light, and let himself out. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after. Then I started unpacking. Silas did not rush things. That was the part I hadn't expected. I'd braced myself for a progression, the move, then the expectation, then the gradual shift in what was owed. But 6 weeks went by, and what arrived in those 6 weeks was just consistency. Silas checked in every few days, always briefly. He texted rather than called. When he came by, he always brought something. Food one time, a small toolkit another time because he'd noticed the cabinet hinge in my kitchen was loose. Once a children's book about animals that Kale pressed against his chest with both arms as though receiving something sacred. He fixed the hinge. He didn't mention it afterward. The evening events work started to thin out after the season peak, and I'd mentioned once that I was considering a day position at a logistics firm I'd heard was hiring. Silas had listened, asked 2 questions about the role and what it would mean for Kale's care schedule, and then 3 days later mentioned, not instructed, mentioned that his company's communications department had a junior coordinator role coming open. "It would suit you," he said, "if you wanted to hear about it. If not, that's fine." I heard about it. What I want you to understand is that I walked into that interview wearing the one good shirt I owned and a pair of borrowed trousers from Benny, and I got the job on my own. The panel was a woman named Dara and a man named Kwesi, and Silas was not in the building. The offer that came through 2 days later was signed by HR. I called him when I got the letter. "Congratulations," he said. "Was there anything, did you—" "No." Straightforward. "You interviewed well. I'm told you managed the scheduling case study faster than any candidate they'd seen in 3 months." I let out a breath I'd been holding. "Theo," his voice shifted slightly, not softer exactly, but more attentive. "You don't need me to open doors for you. I wouldn't have suggested the role if I thought you did." I believed him. The evidence was beginning to stack up in a way that demanded belief. The job changed the architecture of my days. Real hours, a real salary, a desk with my name on a nameplate card, colleagues who asked me to come to lunch. I wore pressed shirts. I cut my hair properly for the first time in months. Kale started at a better daycare near the office, one with an outdoor garden and an afternoon program that he attended 3 times a week. He came home the first Friday with his hands stained again, this time deliberately, with a painting he made that he told me was a dragon. "It looks like a tomato," I said. "It's a tomato dragon," he said, and handed it to me as though that settled the matter. I put it on the fridge. Silas saw it the next time he came by and studied it with full seriousness. "What species?" he asked Kale. "The fierce kind," Kale said. "Of course." Something was changing, and I knew it. Not in a way I had words for at first. It was more like the room temperature shifting by degrees. The way Silas would stay for dinner without me having to ask, because Kale had already climbed up onto the chair beside him as if this were the established order of things. The way I stopped counting the minutes after he arrived to figure out when he'd leave. The way his silence in a room felt the same as his conversation. Easy, without a weight attached. I said something to Benny on the phone one night after Kale was asleep. "He's different," I said. "Obviously," Benny said. "I don't mean status." "I know what you mean." A pause. "Theo, does he look at you like he's cataloging your debts, or does he look at you like you're the most interesting room he's ever walked into?" I didn't answer right away. "Right," Benny said. "The night Silas told me he loved me, we were in my kitchen. This is not a dramatic story of that moment. No rain, no candlelight. Kale was in bed. I was washing up, and Silas was at the table with a document he'd brought to go through, something related to work. He looked up and said, 'I'm in love with you.' Just like that, the way he said things that were true. I turned off the tap. I looked at him. 'I'm not asking you for anything with that. I want you to have the information.' I dried my hands on the towel by the sink. I walked to the table, and I sat down across from him, and I looked at his face, at a man who had never taken anything from me that I hadn't chosen to give, who fixed a cabinet hinge and talked to my son about the species of a tomato dragon. And I said, 'I love you too.' He reached across the table and put his hand over mine. That was it. No announcement, no fanfare, just a hand on mine, and outside the window, the city's nighttime noise, a distant generator, the call of someone 3 streets away, the occasional car, and inside, this new warmth that did not feel like anything borrowed. 2 months later, I met his family. I want to tell you what that was like. The car that came to collect us, the kind of car that Kale wanted to study from every angle. The house that was not a house, but a compound, with a gate and staff who greeted Silas by name. His mother, a woman of 70 with the eyes of someone who has seen through every performance ever attempted in her presence, who looked at me for one long moment and then looked at Kale, who was examining a ceramic lion in her foyer, and said to me, "He has good hands." Meaning careful ones. Meaning someone had taught him to touch beautiful things without breaking them. "I do," I said. She nodded and told a staff member to bring juice for the boy. His family had a name, not just a family name, a name that carries weight in this country the way geological formations carry weight. Old, deep, structural. I knew the name. Everyone knew the name. I had cleaned floors in buildings that bore the name on their brass plates. And none of them, not his mother, not his brother, not the collection of aunts and associates who came and went, treated me as anything other than Silas's partner and Kale's parent. A woman named Aunt Ifeoma told me I had the posture of someone who was used to carrying too much and that I should allow myself to put things down now. I thought about a silver tray in a hallway. "I'm learning," I said. She patted my hand and gave me more food. It was a Saturday in April when Marcus found us. I want to be precise about something. He did not find me because I had been careless. He found me the way people like Marcus find things, through money, through contacts, through the kind of persistent leverage that treats other people as recoverable property. I had known in some part of me that this day would arrive. I had told Silas about Marcus 6 weeks in, sitting at this same kitchen table, and Silas had listened without interruption and then said 2 things. The first was, "You did the right thing." The second was, "Tell me everything, because I need to know what we're protecting against." We had prepared. What I had not prepared for entirely was how small Marcus would look. I was at the Seika gallery in Ikoi. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Silas's company had co-sponsored a cultural exhibition. Silas had invited me and Kale had worn his good shoes without complaint because Silas had promised him a specific painting in the exhibition was bigger than our apartment wall, which turned out to be accurate and which Kale received as personally meaningful. We were standing in front of this painting, a coastal landscape, enormous, taking up the full span of a gallery wall, when I felt the temperature in the room change. I knew before I turned. Marcus was standing at the gallery entrance, 60 feet away. He had a woman I didn't recognize beside him and what appeared to be a junior associate. He was wearing the cream suit he wore to events when he wanted to be noticed. He'd been scanning the room and he found me in the way a person finds a thing they've been looking for, with that particular stillness of someone who has just confirmed a suspicion. He started to walk forward. He made it 4 steps before 2 of Silas's security, men I had never seen do anything except stand quietly, placed themselves in a formation that was not aggressive but was absolute. Not a wall exactly, more like a fact, the kind you can't argue with. Silas stopped. I watched this from 60 feet away, Kale's hand in mine, Silas standing half a step to my left. Silas had not moved, had not signaled anything I'd seen. The security had simply responded to proximity the way a tide responds to the moon, inevitably, without drama. Marcus looked past them at me. I could see his expression from here. The calculation. And then, for the first time in 4 years, the first crack in the absolute certainty that had always occupied his face. The realization that the calculus had changed in a way he hadn't modeled. Because this was not Theo, the caretaker. This was not the Omega in the borrowed coat with 46,000 naira and a sock. Standing next to Silas, that name, that family, that structural weight. I was not someone you reclaimed. I was not someone you sent a car for. I was not something on a list of recoverable assets. Marcus was standing at the boundary of a world he had never been invited into, and he had just discovered he didn't have the height requirement. I watched him try to find another angle. The junior associate next to him said something. Marcus didn't respond. The woman with him touched his arm. He shook it off slightly. He looked at me for one more moment, and what I felt looking back at him was the most complete nothing I have ever experienced. Not anger, not grief, not the phantom ache of 4 years. Just nothing. The particular emptiness of something that has already been resolved. I turned to Kale. "Do you want to go see the sculpture room? I heard there's one shaped like a boat." Kale looked up from where he'd been studying the painting's brushwork up close. "A real boat?" "A real sculpture of a boat." He considered. "Okay." He reached up for my hand, and then, after a moment's thought, reached up for Silas's with his other. Silas took it without missing a beat, and the three of us walked further into the gallery. I did not look back. Later, I know this because Benny told me, because he'd been at the gallery too, part of the general public that attended, Marcus stood at that boundary for another few minutes. He said something to the security that they did not respond to. He looked toward the corridor we'd walked into. He waited, perhaps, for me to come back, to look back at least, to acknowledge the 4 years in some way that would give him a role to play in the story. I was in the sculpture room telling Kale that the boat could not, in fact, sail, but that didn't mean it wasn't real. "Where would it sail?" Kale asked. "Somewhere good," Silas said. He was looking at me when he said it. Kale accepted this geography, and we moved on to the next room, and behind us, somewhere behind the gallery's clean white walls and its evening crowd and the entirety of everything that now constituted my life, Marcus watched the corridor we disappeared into. When Benny told me later, I asked how long Marcus had waited. "About 10 minutes, Benny said. Then he left. Did he look? Like someone who had just understood, completely, and too late, what he had in his hands and what he'd done with it. Benny paused. Yeah, he looked like that. I thought about this for perhaps 3 seconds. Then Kale called from the other room that he'd found the boat painting he wanted and that I needed to come see it immediately. And Silas laughed. Actual, unguarded laughter, the kind that he saved for Kale. And I walked away from the thought of Marcus the way you walk away from a room you've already finished with. No ceremony, no backward glance. Just forward, just the sculpture room, and the boat, and the painting, and Kale's voice, high and certain, telling us both exactly where to stand to see it properly. Silas's hand found the small of my back. Outside, through the gallery's tall windows, the afternoon was finishing itself in ordinary gold. A car would come for us in an hour. Kale would fall asleep on the drive home with Pip in his arms, and Silas would carry him up without being asked. I would stand in my kitchen, with its working taps and its radiator that needed a tap, and I would look at the tomato dragon on the fridge. And Marcus would drive away from the Seika gallery in his cream suit, back to a house that held no warmth that anyone had chosen to put there. And I would not think about that at all. The end.